One of the things that falls out of that sort of weird overlap in terms of residual powers at the federal and provincial level, where the federal government is responsible for Indian education but not any other kind of education, is that, and also sort of coupled with that, the idea that we don't really have to spend a ton of money here because this isn't a permanent system anyway, and eventually the Indigenous students are just going to be assimilated into the sort of regular provincial school systems, is that the federal government, tries to save money doing this. So, throughout the period of time when residential schools are operating actively, the federal government is providing a per student amount to schools to run them. So the government sort of recognized that it's not fair to ask the churches to pay for everything. So the government is providing a certain amount of money to educate each Indigenous child that comes to a given school. Okay? It's important to understand that that amount is never high, like is always lower than the amount that the provincial government hands over for educating a child in sort of a normal school. Which means that these schools are chronically underfunded, and they are both chronically underfunded and being asked to do more than other schools are. So, for example, if you think about the high school or the schools that you attended, very few of them were responsible for not just paying teachers and having classrooms and ensuring that you had books, but also ensuring that you were fed, had clothing, had heat at the end of the day, had blankets, had showers, had all of that sort of stuff, right? Residential schools, by virtue of being residential, also need to provide room and board for students, and they are being expected to provide room and board for students, which is a larger expense than you would see in sort of a in the kind of school that most of you probably attended, at the same time as they're being funded less than other schools. This creates a lot of problems. Okay, sometimes the funds available to these schools would be supplemented by, for example, parishes and churches doing fundraising and sort of giving offerings to sort of support these endeavors. But this kind of support is uncertain, um, and it is uneven in that, for example, if you're dealing with a school that is run by a relatively wealthy denomination or a relatively wealthy church, you're more likely to get this kind of support. And if you're run by a relatively poorer congregation, you're not going to get it. And also to be aware that this kind of money is also pretty cyclical. It waxes and wanes. So, for example, during the First World War, when the churches were doing a lot of fundraising and whatnot, and sort of doing a lot of giving to support troops and to support war widows and orphans of war and all that kind of stuff, the funding that's going to residential schools essentially dries up. So this sort of money from denominational support is unpredictable. You can't count on it. The other sort of, there's a couple of other things that sort of manage to make this work, and they are part of why we sort of talk about many problems occurring in residential schools in this country. So, one of the solutions that many residential schools came up with in order to deal with this sort of funding shortfall, right, where they need to spend a bunch of money they don't have, is essentially to send students out on work experience, sort of pretty extensively. And the schools talked about this as though it was a learning experience. So the idea was that students were learning valuable, really, really practical skills, right? So you would have students who had been contracted out to work on farms around the school, and that sort of means that the farmer would pay the school some rate for a day or a half day, and a student would show up and weed the garden or till the soil or plant grain or do any of those things. And the school sort of talked about it like that was an opportunity for these students to learn farming, which from their perspective was a really, really important skill in terms of being able to survive in the Western world. But it is an inappropriate occupation for young women. That's not something that sort of happens. So when we talk about sort of this kind of work experience project, you'd have sort of young men, boys being sent out on local farms. So essentially, you could pay an Indigenous student less than whatever minimum wage is. This is really a way for farmers to get cheap labor, and that's why farmers sort of consented to do it. And then young women were often given work doing what they call piecework sewing. So that is the process, for example, where before we have mechanical machines to do things like sew on buttons, Okay, you would do everything else on a piece of clothing on a machine, and then you would send all of the dresses and all of the buttons to someone who did piecework sewing, and you would say agree to pay them 8 or 10 cents or something for every dress that they sewed all the buttons on. And that kind of work was done by young women in Indian residential schools, again, as part of the idea that that kind of domestic labor, the ability to sew, the ability to cook, the ability to care for children, was an important part of being able to function in Western society. So there's that kind of piece, and that in and of itself as an idea is not necessarily a problem, right? There's a lot of sort of programs in a contemporary school context where we start talking about the value of that kind of thing. From an educational perspective, it allows you to put a bunch of different skills together. It allows you to sort of figure out why, for example, your calculations of how much water those 15 acres are going to need matters, because you have to sort of design your systems around like there's some value in that. So don't think that this is entirely a problem. Where it becomes a problem is where this becomes half of a student's school day. And that's an issue, because if we sort of talk about the experience of residential schools, which we will do in a bit, it becomes very obvious very quickly that part of the challenge in that process is that you have students who are by and large not prepared for the kind of academic work that they're being asked to do, and then they are being asked to do it in a shorter time period. So there's that kind of problem. The other thing that we sort of have to talk about in terms of what happens when you have insufficient funding like that, is sort of two things. And one of them is that the schools try to save money where they can, and we'll sort of talk about what that looks like. And that also sort of leads on to you don't generally pay your teachers quite as much. So when we start talking about the TRC, which we will get to a little later on in the semester, we'll have a conversation, for example, about what people who experience residential schools said about them. And one of the things that comes up really, really often in those testimonies and in those comments is, I was always cold and I was always hungry. And that's sort of partially because if you're on a really, really, really tight budget, putting a little bit of extra water in the oatmeal in the morning and turning the heat down a couple of degrees to avoid having to spend so much to heat the building is a way that you can kind of make the pennies work. But it sort of makes the experience of learning actually very difficult, as any of you who sort of went to school in a very old building. My high school was built in the 1940s, I think. And so I can definitely remember winter days where we were sitting in class in our jackets and our mittens, and that's not really a great way to do things like, take notes. Because the school was that cold, right? That's not a really great learning environment. So there's that kind of challenge that comes with that. Um, and that's before we sort of start getting into things like, yeah, if you don't give children enough to eat, to grow, enough calories in that sort of way, it becomes very difficult for them to learn because their brains aren't working. This is the premise behind breakfast clubs of Canada. This is the premise behind ensuring that school lunches are delivered to children who might not otherwise get them. Like, this is well known, but we sort of do it anyway. And then the other sort of thing that comes out of that sort of penny pinching, I guess, and that funding question, is that often it means really low teacher salaries, because there isn't the money to pay them appropriately. And what that means is that if you're being asked to teach, say, grade 3, if you're a grade 3 teacher, right, and you have the choice between a position in a residential school and in a school in your home community, no matter how big that community is, you're probably going to get paid more in your home community, and the job is going to be easier. And when I say the job is going to be easier, I'm going to ask you guys to think about this sort of question now. Who is actually attending residential schools, and what are you actually asking teachers to do? So one of the things that sort of comes out of that is that if we were going to talk about anything like residential schools today, the people who would be teaching in those schools would be, for example, English as a second language specialists or French as a second language specialists, depending on where you are, i.e., we've recognized in a contemporary context that trying to teach students in a language they don't really understand is really challenging. So we need some specialists to do that. When we're running residential schools, for the most part, that is not the case. And besides which, if you have that kind of specialist qualification, you're generally not willing to work for the sort of lower wages. And what that means is that residential schools on the whole were more likely to have unqualified teachers, i.e., the government sort of looked the other way when people hired the sort of people who were willing to show up and do the work, even if they weren't, for example, finish their education degrees, if they didn't have the proper certifications in that sort of space. And then the other thing that sort of happens a lot is that if you have that sort of situation where you always get paid less on reserves on residential schools, and you sort of can get paid more in the city, then in a lot of ways you move as soon as you can get another job available to you. So there's a lot of turnover in sort of the educator roles in a lot of residential schools, especially when we're talking about like layperson staff rather than sort of priests and nuns, because they made more money elsewhere. And that kind of turnover, for those of you who don't sort of study this, is really, really, really bad for kids. One of the things that they were sort of talking about in response to the coronavirus pandemic, for example, is that it might be valuable to have all the teachers move up with their elementary school students. So instead of a second grade teacher teaching a new crop of second graders, that second grade teacher, it might be valuable to have that second grade teacher keep their entire second grade class and just teach them the third grade curriculum. Because that way the relationships that those students had built with their teachers help sustain them and provide a sense of sort of normal and a sense of continuity going through the sort of next year of their education. Because those relationships are really, really, really important. And if you sort of push that even further, that means that becomes even more important when you have children who fundamentally cannot build those kinds of relationships with their parents because they don't get to see them. So there's that kind of challenge. So that kind of high turnover makes it really, really, really difficult. And sort of what you find when you sort of look into the data on that is that that kind of instability in education tends to essentially make students not trust the process and not trust that anyone cares about them. And that sort of sense that someone cares about you and cares if you learn to do this well is a really important part of what helps motivate people to do things that are otherwise difficult, right? Learning long division, for example, right? If you think the person teaching it to you cares, then that's something that's going to help you sort of struggle through the process where you're learning it. And I want you guys to understand that that's not something that went away. In a lot of ways, that sort of that challenge about accessing people who stay, adults in particular, and teachers who stay in Indigenous communities and in primarily Indigenous schools is very much still an issue. There's still a lot of turnover in schools on or near reserves. There's still a lot of turnover in teachers who work with primarily First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students because the work is difficult. And the work is difficult for a number of reasons that we sort of are going to get into in the next little while. But be aware that that sort of question about turnover is still an issue, and the issue about funding in general is still an issue. The federal government is still not funding Indigenous schools at the same level as the provinces are funding sort of regular schools for every other sort of person, every other student in the country. So that's an important thing to understand in terms of funding, is that not so much that there's not a lot of bad things going on in these environments, but in a lot of ways, these schools are facing a lot of structural challenges on top of other sort of questions about, hey, should we really be trying to eliminate an entire culture at once? So the next thing we're going to talk about a little bit is the experience of those schools, what those schools are like sort of inside of them, and we'll go on from there.